All right, let's jump into this deep dive on MDMA. We've got a ton of research and articles here ready to unpack this infamous little molecule. Ready to get into it?
Absolutely. I'm always up for exploring a good brain-bending chemical.
Perfect. So we'll be looking at both the science and the cultural impact of MDMA. It's going to be a trip, that's for sure.
Circle up.
Right. Now, we all know MDMA has a certain reputation, ecstasy, Molly, the party drug. But there's so much more to it than just the club scene.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's a molecule with a lot of layers, that's for sure.
Exactly. So we're going to peel back those layers and uncover its potential medical applications, dive into the complex world of its effects, and, well, just try to understand what makes this molecule tick.
Sounds like a plan.
All right, so let's kick things off with the basics. What exactly is MDMA? Like, chemically speaking, what are we dealing with here?
Okay, so MDMA is a substituted amphetamine, which basically means it's related to drugs like speed, amphetamines. But here's the thing, there's a key difference.
Okay, I'm listening.
It's that methylphenidioxy part of its name. That little piece makes all the difference. It makes MDMA much more focused on serotonin in the brain. And that, my friend, explains those feelings of euphoria and empathy that people often associate with it.
So it's not just some random upper. It actually targets specific brain chemicals. It's pretty fascinating. But let's get to the good stuff. What does this serotonin surge actually feel like? I mean, why do people love it so much?
Well, users often describe this this rush of euphoria, right? Like this deep sense of connection with others, and their senses just seem heightened. Music sounds incredible, lights are more vibrant. It's almost like the world is turned up a notch or something.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I can definitely see the appeal, especially in a rave setting, right? With the music and the lights and everything. But I've also heard about the not-so-fun side. Like, isn't there a lot of teeth grinding going on?
Yeah, that's the bruxism. You might catch yourself clenching your jaw. It's a pretty common side effect. And of course, all that dancing for hours can lead to dehydration, which is something to be mindful of for sure.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So it's like, you got to stay hydrated, but you might end up chewing your face off?
Pretty much. But in all seriousness, it's super important to remember that everyone's experience can be different, right? It depends on the dose, the setting, and even the individual themselves.
Makes sense. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Yeah, man.
All right, so we've got ecstasy, Mandy, Molly. Are we talking about the same thing here? Or are there subtle differences between all these terms?
Generally speaking, yeah, they all refer to MDMA. Ecstasy usually means the pills, while Mandy and Molly are more for the powder form. But here's the thing, and it's a big thing. The purity of street drugs is, well, it's notoriously unreliable.
Okay, that's not good.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is there's a huge risk of getting something that's not actually MDMA.
You got it.
Yeah.
There's a big chance of adulterants, meaning you might not be getting pure MDMA. You really don't know what you're getting.
So that whole Molly's pure MDMA thing is a myth.
Pretty much, yeah. It's risky, and it's always a gamble.
And I'm guessing mixing it with other drugs is a big no-no.
Oh, absolutely. Combining MDMA with alcohol or certain medications like SSRIs, which are common antidepressants, can be incredibly dangerous. The interactions are unpredictable and, potentially life-threatening. It's just not worth the risk.
Got it. So we've covered the fun and the not-so-fun parts of recreational use. But I know there's another side to MDMA, this whole therapeutic potential thing. How did this party drug end up being considered for, treating serious mental health issues? It seems like a pretty wild idea, to be honest.
It's a fascinating story, really. Back in the 1970s, you had chemists like Alexander Shulgin exploring MDMA, and then you had some therapists, folks like Leo Zeff, who saw potential in it. They thought it could help people open up in therapy, reduce their fear,
I see. So it's like it lowers people's defenses and allows them to talk about things they might not be able to otherwise?
Yeah.
That makes sense. What happened to that research, though? Did anything actually come of it?
There are a ton of anecdotal reports about MDMA's effectiveness in treating conditions like PTSD, anxiety, even relationship problems. People were seeing some pretty amazing results. But then, of course, it became illegal. And that basically shut down research for decades.
Wow. So its potential was recognized early on, but the legal situation kind of threw a wrench in the works.
Yeah.
So what about now? What's the state of MDMA-assisted therapy today? Is it completely off the table?
Not at all. In recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in MDMA as a therapeutic tool. Legitimate research is finally happening again. In fact, the FDA even granted MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD a breakthrough therapy designation. That's a big deal.
That's huge. So it's like MDMA is finally stepping out of the shadows and into the world of legitimate medicine. But I have to ask, what about the long-term effects, especially if it's going to be used in therapy? What do we actually know about that?
That's the million-dollar question, right? While the research is still ongoing, there is some evidence to suggest that MDMA can be neurotoxic, particularly with heavy long-term use. We're talking potential structural and functional changes in the brain, possibly even cognitive impairment.
Okay, so that's not good news. But is it like the more you take, the higher the risk?
That seems to be the case, yeah. A lot of these changes seem to be dose dependent. But there's good news too. MDMA is generally considered less addictive than stimulants like methamphetamine or cocaine. So it's not quite as scary as some other drugs out there.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
But even if it's not as physically addictive, couldn't people still become psychologically dependent on MDMA?
Absolutely. There's definitely a chance of psychological dependence, and some folks have reported withdrawal symptoms. It's not something to take lightly, but again, the context of use is really important here. Someone using ecstasy at a rave every weekend is facing different risks than someone participating in a carefully structured therapy program, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we've covered what MDMA is, its effects both good and bad, and its potential for both harm and healing. It seems like a pretty complex drug with fascinating and complicated history. And its future, well, that's still up in the air.
Yeah, no doubt. It's a story that's still being written for sure.
So to be continued, I guess. I'm really curious to dive deeper into the ethical and societal implications of all this. What are your thoughts on where all of this is heading?
Well, MDMA presents a unique challenge to us, right? I mean, it has this potential to be a powerful tool for therapy. But its recreational use and the risks that come with it, those can't be ignored. It's a conversation that society needs to have, for sure. And it's one that we'll be exploring further in our next segment.
Perfect. I'm ready for round two.
Yeah.
This deep dive has already given me a much better understanding of MDMA. We've only scratched the surface here, but it's clear that this is a molecule with a lot to offer, both good and bad. So stay tuned, folks, because we're just getting started.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of MDMA. Last time we were exploring the science and the history of MDMA, from its early days in the lab to its rise as a party drug and, and its potential for therapy.
We talked about the good, the bad, and the downright ugly, and it seems pretty clear that MDMA is a substance that, sparks strong opinions.
Yeah, for sure. Today we're going to kind of shift gears a bit, and we're going to tackle the ethical and societal implications of MDMA use. This is where things get really interesting, because we're not just talking about, molecules and serotonin anymore. We're talking about values, beliefs, and, how we as a society decide what's acceptable and what's not.
Yeah, it's like we can geek out about receptors and neurotoxicity all day long, but it all comes down to, what place does MDMA have in our world, if any at all?
Yeah, exactly. And there are no easy answer to that question. There are so many factors that we need to think about, like the risks of, recreational use, the potential for harm reduction, the promise of, therapeutic breakthroughs, the legal and regulatory hurdles, the cultural stigma surrounding it. It's a tangled web for sure.
So how do we untangle this web? Where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is by addressing the elephant in the room, right? MDMA is illegal in most countries, so we should probably talk about the arguments for and against prohibition.
All right. Let's do it. Lay it on me. What are the reasons for keeping MDMA illegal?
Okay, so the main arguments for prohibition are pretty straightforward. People are worried about the harms associated with MDMA use, right?
Yeah.
Addiction, overdose, long-term health problems, you name it. Proponents of prohibition basically say that keeping it illegal is a way to protect people from those harms.
It makes sense, especially when you think about all the stuff we discussed earlier about adulterants and how people buying ecstasy on the street often have no clue what they're actually getting.
Oh, absolutely. That's a massive concern. But critics of prohibition argue that it actually does more harm than good. They say that by driving MDMA underground, you're just making it more dangerous.
Because it becomes harder to regulate the production and distribution, and it's more likely that people will end up taking something that's laced with who knows what.
Exactly. Plus, they argue that prohibition steps on personal liberty and autonomy. The idea that adults should have the right to make their own choices about what they put in their bodies, as long as they're not harming others.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's like, where do you draw the line between personal freedom and protecting people from potential harm? It's not black and white.
Not at all. And, even if MDMA were to be legalized, which is a whole other can of worms, it wouldn't magically solve all the problems. We'd still need to figure out things like age restrictions, quality control, responsible use guidelines, and how to deal with potential negative consequences like impaired driving.
It's like opening Pandora's box. You can have all these new challenges to grapple with.
For sure. And not to mention the massive task of public health education, making
Huh.
sure that people have access to accurate information about the risks and benefits of MDMA and how to use it safely if they choose to.
You can't just throw it out there without giving people the tools and knowledge to navigate it responsibly.
Right. Education is key. But let's circle back to the potential therapeutic benefits of MDMA. If it's showing promise in treating conditions like PTSD, should that factor into the legalization debate?
I think it absolutely should. We can't ignore the potential for MDMA to help people who are really struggling. It could be life-changing for some folks, especially those who haven't had success with traditional therapies.
I agree. But some people argue that even if MDMA proves to be effective, it should stay a controlled substance, only available under strict medical supervision.
Because of the fear that if it's legal for therapy, what's stopping people from using it recreationally? The slippery slope argument.
Exactly. And there's always the concern about potential abuse and dependence, even in a therapeutic setting. So it's this constant balancing act, weighing the potential benefits against the potential risks.
It's tough. There's so much to consider.
Absolutely. But at the end of the day, I think open and honest dialogue is the only way forward. We need to listen to each other's concerns, be willing to compromise, and try to find solutions that work for everyone.
Yeah, finding that sweet spot where we protect public health while respecting individual rights. And of course, all of this is happening against the backdrop of MDMA's cultural impact, which is another whole layer to unpack.
Right. We've been talking about MDMA in this very serious clinical way, but let's not forget that it's a part of culture too, especially in the music and rave scenes.
Absolutely. It's almost like you can't talk about MDMA without talking about the music, the dancing, the lights, that whole experience.
It's all intertwined. And for a lot of people who use MDMA in that context, it's not just about getting high. It's about connection, community, and a sense of belonging,
Hmm.
which, let's be honest, can be pretty hard to come by in today's world.
No doubt. Something we all crave. But of course, there's that flip side, the negative stereotypes, the misconceptions.
Yeah, a lot of people write it off as a party drug for kids who are just trying to escape reality.
Exactly. And that kind of judgment makes it tough to have a nuanced conversation about the potential benefits of MDMA, both therapeutically and culturally.
Totally. And that's why it's so important to push back against those stereotypes and recognize the diversity of experiences and motivations behind MDMA use. It's not just one thing.
Right, like we've been saying, this isn't a black and white issue. But let's dive into the specifics. How has MDMA culture actually impacted society?
Well, one of the most significant impacts has been the rise of harm reduction initiatives.
Harm reduction. Can you explain what that means in the context of MDMA use?
Sure. Harm reduction is all about minimizing the negative consequences associated with drug use. It's about recognizing that people are going to use drugs, whether we like it or not, and focusing on ways to make it as safe as possible.
So instead of just saying don't do drugs, it's more like if you're going to do them, at least don't die.
Exactly. And when it comes to MDMA, that can look like a few different things. It can be about testing drugs to make sure they're not laced with other stuff, providing accurate information about dosage and potential risks, and even creating safe spaces for people to use the drug.
Like those organizations that set up booths at music festivals where you can get your drugs tested. I've seen that before.
Exactly. That's harm reduction in action. And it's a direct result of MDMA culture. People within that culture recognize that there are risks involved and they want to protect themselves and their community.
I can see that. They're being proactive, not just sticking their heads in the sand.
Right. They're not naive about the potential dangers, but they're also realistic and want to find ways to minimize those dangers, which I think is a much more effective approach than just trying to scare people away from drugs altogether.
I think you're right. It's about being pragmatic and meeting people where they're at.
Totally. And another positive impact of MDMA culture is that it's really raised awareness of mental health issues.
Interesting. How so?
Well, as we talked about earlier, MDMA is showing a lot of promise in treating things like PTSD and anxiety. And because of that research, there have been so many more conversations about mental health and the need for better treatments.
Because if this drug that's been so demonized for decades can help people heal, then maybe we need to rethink our whole approach to mental health care.
Precisely. It's challenging a lot of deeply ingrained beliefs and opening the door to new possibilities.
Yeah, it's like MDMA shaking things up and forcing us to look at mental health in a whole new way. But okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. The science, the culture, the ethics. Where does all of this lead? What's next for MDMA?
Well, it's kind of at a crossroads, right? I mean, will it stay this controversial substance, lurking in the shadows, or will it find its way into the mainstream as a legitimate medicine, or maybe even as something that adults can use responsibly, like, who knows, maybe one day.
All right, so let's put on our future predicting hats here. What do you think are the biggest factors that are going to shape the future of MDMA?
I'd say it comes down to three main things: the science, how society's views are changing, and of course, all the legal and regulatory stuff. Each one of those is going to be a big part of how this all plays out.
Makes sense. Okay, let's break it down, starting with the science. What are some of the big research questions that we still need answers to?
Well, long-term safety is a big one, right? I mean, we need more data on the potential for neurotoxicity, both in recreational use and in therapy. Remember, we talked about those potential brain changes. Well, there's a lot we still don't know about what happens down the line.
Yeah, that's a biggie. And what about the effectiveness of MDMA-assisted therapy? How much do we actually know about how well it works for different conditions?
We've touched on PTSD, anxiety, autism, even things like addiction, but a lot of that is still pretty early stage. We need more hardcore research, like clinical trials to really nail down how effective it is for each specific thing. We need to know the right doses, the best ways to use it in therapy, and of course, which people are actually going to benefit from it.
It sounds like there are a lot of moving parts. So it's not like MDMA-assisted therapy is going to be available at every clinic tomorrow.
Right, there's still work to be done. And then there's the whole question of other potential uses. We briefly talked about end-of-life anxiety. Are there any other areas that are being explored?
That's a fascinating area. It's like, can MDMA help people come to terms with death? What a powerful idea.
Totally. It's about helping people who are terminally ill, deal with their fear, their sadness, those big existential questions. Imagine facing the end of your life and feeling a sense of peace and acceptance. That's pretty incredible, right?
It is. And it really feels like we're moving away from that old drugs are bad, just say no message towards something, I don't know, more humane, more understanding of how these substances can actually be helpful.
I think you're right. There's a real shift happening. And it's not just with MDMA. We're seeing it with other drugs, too. More openness to harm reduction, decriminalization, even talks about legalization.
It seems like the war on drugs is finally losing its grip. People are realizing that it hasn't worked. We need a new approach.
Totally. And a big part of that is how science is changing our understanding of addiction. It's not a moral failing, it's a health issue. And that realization is leading to more compassionate, more evidence-based drug policies.
Okay, so looking at all of this, the research, the changes in how we think about drugs, the legal landscape, what's your prediction for MDMA in, say, the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I think we're going to see a lot more research happening, for sure, both on the therapeutic side and on safety. And as we get more data, I think MDMA-assisted therapy is going to become more accepted. I mean, who knows? Maybe it'll even become a standard treatment for some conditions like PTSD.
That's a big thought. It'd be a huge step forward.
Do you think we'll see any movement towards legalization, though?
It's hard to say. But I do think decriminalization and legalization are going to be bigger parts of the conversation, at least in some places.
Okay.
And that could mean better regulation, harm reduction, and maybe even controlled access for adults who want to use MDMA recreationally.
Right. But of course, there are always going to be people who are against any kind of drug use. And the risks, both when using it for fun and in therapy, those are real, and we can't pretend they don't exist.
Absolutely. We can't just ignore the risks, but as we learn more about MDMA, I think we can find ways to use it safely and responsibly, We need to be smart about it. And that means having open and honest conversations about the science, the ethics, everything. Well said. I think that's the perfect way to wrap up our deep dive on MDMA. We've gone from its chemical structure to its impact on society, from the lab to the rave to the therapist's office. It's been quite a journey.
We've really explored it all, haven't we? The science, the history, the good, the bad, the potential for healing, the ethical questions. It's a lot to take in.
It is. But hopefully this deep dive has left you with, a better understanding of this amazing, complex molecule, and maybe even more questions than answers, because that's what this is all about, right?
Curiosity is key, I think. That's what keeps us moving forward.
Exactly. So until next time, folks, stay curious and keep those brains buzzing.